Hi, I'm Dave Van Oss, Agricultural Markets Manager for Libro Credit Union. Libro is very excited to be this year's presenting sponsor for the Virtual Outdoor Farm Show. We truly hope that your farm business finds great value with this upcoming session.
Welcome to Canada's Digital Farm Show. My name is Jennifer Glennie and I am a reporter with Farmtario. Today I am joined by Jonathan Zettler. Hello Jonathan, how are you?
Great, how about yourself?
I'm doing very well, thank you. So Jonathan today will be speaking on SWAT Maps and how he uses them to manage his soil fertility responses. And he'll also be speaking on how temporal and spatial factors affect soil fertility and soil fertility response. So Jonathan Zettler is an agronomist with Fieldwalker Agronomy, which he founded. And he is a University of Guelph Bachelor of Science in Agriculture graduate. And he primarily works with customers in Huron, Bruce, Grey, Wellington, and Perth counties. All right, so you can take it away, John.
Thank you. So I'm going to share a presentation here. So the title of the presentation is Capturing, Measuring, and Managing Soil Variability. And what we're really trying to do around that is capture, create, and manage fertility response zones. And we talk fertility response zones because when you go and apply an input, what you're really trying to do is get return on investment or response to doing that added labor rather than just throwing stuff out, hoping something happens. So before we get into it, I just kind of wanted to talk about which nutrients are mobile and which nutrients aren't mobile within the soil, what we mean by temporal variability and spatial variability, and then the interaction of temporal and spatial variability. So mobile nutrients, we're predominantly talking about nitrogen, sulfur, and boron, and that just means that the plant takes it up through soil water and they move within soil water and can be lost. And this is why you have to repeatedly put them on every year. And then there's non-mobile nutrients such as phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and many of the other micronutrients that you apply them to the soil and they get tied up in either soil organic matter or clay content. When agronomists talk about temporal variability, what we're really referring to is how much rain did we get that year relative to other years, and how much heat did we get from that year relative to other years, or from month to month. And there's areas within the field that will respond one way under certain conditions and another way under other conditions. And then spatial variability just refers to differences in the physical field from spot to spot. So you can draw a square or draw a rectangle or an oblong shape on grouping that area together. So when I talk about temporal and spatial variability being to interact together, what we're trying to do is group those areas in the field that behave a certain way one year together under certain weather conditions. So there's probably spots in every field that flood out, for example, even with tile drainage. And those areas are going to behave the same from a mobile nutrient standpoint. So you want to group those areas together. So from a soil fertility standpoint, what did you start with? You have your native soils, the parent materials, the natural vegetation, the climate that made what you're working on. And that's great from a regional level, but when it comes to farm-specific information, it's not really that beneficial. So you're trying to identify areas within the field that some years maybe are too wet or too dry and trying to manage that. And then there's the temperature factors. So being too cold will reduce phosphorus mineralization and availability in certain years. And then nitrogen mineralization this spring, we saw some of that in winter wheat, for example. Or maybe it's the interaction of water and temperature and it's too hot and boron, for example, isn't releasing on sandy ground. And then the other piece would be shading. So in years where there's a lot more cloud cover, you don't have as much photosynthesis happening. And then from a soil fertility standpoint, as far as spatial variability goes, it kind of depends on the time frame that you're looking at for the factors that cause it. So you're going to have additions and removals within the field. From an addition standpoint, there's going to be man-made factors, and a lot of systems do a great job of capturing this. So whether fertilizer or manure or compost got applied on one side of the field and not the other, that can be captured. Where I see systems fall apart is they're not looking at longer time horizons where soil erosion, whether it's tillage, wind, or water, has affected additions and removals, or they're unable to model water-soluble nutrients moving within the field. So even something like phosphorus, example, has a water-soluble portion that's moving within the field, and then either through drainage tile or through runoff. And having the right model can capture that where it's being lost and where it's accumulating. So when you're looking to implement site-specific management of soil fertility, I had done this poll in January around, have you had soil erosion on your field? And almost 90% of the people said yes. But I bet if I turned around and said, how many of you are trying to capture that in terms of how much soil erosion you're having in the field, and put it into a digital format, they would probably flip around and probably no would be 90% in terms of it affecting their soil sampling. So there's kind of two approaches to capturing variability when it comes to soil sampling. You could go out and sample everything and capture as much information as possible. And probably the most common thing on the market today that does that would be the grid approach. And you do that at a resolution that you can kind of afford. The challenge with it is you have to start over with the same process every single time when doing it. There's no model to reduce or improve sampling costs and efficiency in the future. The other piece is it's not really suitable for managing temporal variability from year to year. So how much nitrogen is releasing this year versus last year? Well, I don't know of anyone out there that's going to go and do a grid sample to that. It's just not financially feasible. Alternative, or almost the polar opposite of this, would be using a sample. The challenge with doing this is that you need to get things right, that you're grouping areas that respond the same. If you can do this, then it does become suitable for managing temporal variability from year to year. And there's quite a few systems or methods on the market that do this, and zones could be built off of a number of different layers. But you have to pick the one that matches it properly. So how effective is your fertility program today? So this is kind of a matrix I had made around digital ag effectiveness. So across the top, you have sound agronomy and weak agronomy, and then it can be applied precisely or imprecisely. Imprecisely could mean flat rate, or it could mean maybe zones that weren't representative necessarily of the field. And so if you take weak agronomy and you're applying the wrong rate precisely across the field, it's largely ineffective, because putting even worse than what flat rate would be. And that's where weak agronomy applied at a flat rate is probably at least partially effective, because you have areas within the field that likely that's the right rate for. Using sound agronomy at a flat rate, there's still a portion of the field where it's not going to be 100% effective. It's going to be moderately effective, because it's going to be either too much or too little for areas of that field. Now, if you can do sound agronomy and apply it very precisely to areas that respond, I would consider that highly effective in maximizing your fertility dollars. So the fundamentals of fertility management and the goal of variable rate is to get the right rate on in the right zone. And you have to design those response zones properly first if you want to use a zone type system. And then that's where the sound agronomy comes in, and getting the right fertilizer rate for that area and getting the optimal return. One thing I would like to change, instead of calling it variable rate, maybe we should be calling it optimal rate, because in a lot of respects, variable rate confers that we're just adjusting the rate across the field. Well, what we're really trying to do is get the right rate for that zone and how it's going to respond. So I kind of wanted to go through how much we're spending in typical crop rotation around fertility dollars and where maybe some opportunities are. So in corn, this might be a typical fertility budget for many areas. Other areas might spend more, other areas might spend less. So you have roughly 160 units of actual N, 80 units of P2O5 kind of thing is what's across the bottom here. So the questions to start asking yourself are, what is a typical fertility budget? So which nutrients are affected by temporal variability from year to year, which would be mainly nitrogen and sulfur. And then which nutrients are affected by spatial variability? Well, pretty well all of them are within reason. And then what's the soil supply capacity for those different areas to make up the balance? And then how do you go about capturing that? And we'll get into some of those later in the presentation. Soybeans, obviously we're not putting as much on. Winter wheat, if you're removing the straw, you're probably putting more on, and this might be a typical fertilizer budget for soft red in the bulk of the province. So the question becomes, well, what's the size of the prize that we can adjust? And using spring 2020 retail pricing over a 3-year crop rotation, you're looking at almost $480 an acre that you could be adjusting on each acre over that 3-year rotation. That may not be the right rate. A lot of growers that are doing variable rate have probably played around with phosphorus and potassium, but that's only about 40% of the total crop input budget over that 3 years. So you still have another 40-45% between nitrogen and sulfur that most probably haven't touched or have tried and maybe failed around trying to do variable rate. There's probably some opportunity there to make improvements. And we didn't discuss variable rate lime, variable rate seed, variable rate site-specific or soil-applied crop protection products like Sencor, for example, or maybe adjusting your prime extra rate depending on soil type. Or in some instances, I've heard growers doing variable rate Allevo, for example, or optimal rate Allevo for areas that have soybean cyst nematode. So when we talk fertilizer response, the system that I'm working with today takes into account soil, water, topography, and then builds a model on that. So here's an example field of the soil, water, and topography model. The red zones at the top are the heaviest water shedding, and then the dark zones at the bottom here, zones 9 and 10, accumulate water. If you're new to the SWAT zones model. What we're trying to show here is that, yes, the soil tests maybe aren't super strong, but there really isn't that wide of a spread in a lot of respects in the soil fertility side. But yet we still see significant differences within this field on crop growth. So this is a 22-acre field, not huge by any stretch of the imagination. And let's assume that you wanted to use the grid approach to sampling. Well, how much of the variability would you capture using the grid approach on a field this size? In a lot of ways, even using a 1-acre grid, you would have multiple zones in the same field. So at soil sample point 20, if I had grid sampled this on 1-acre grids, I would have knolls and depressions that accumulate water in the same, and there's more than one spot in this field where that would occur. 2.5-acre grids would even make it worse. You're just increasing the size of the area that you're not able to capture. So in this instance here, we have some nice green corn. It's kind of in a mid-slope position. On this knoll here, we have the corn burning up. Even though it has one of the higher soil tests within the field, just the lack of water availability is affecting crop growth. So when we go to characterize the field, we have a system ahead of time to classify how the different areas of the field behave and the appropriate fertilizer response for that zone. So think of soil, water, and topography maps as an index of how to group soil response zones together for a specific field. Those groupings are common to all fields and then will behave similarly, but sampling will require to determine what the absolute values are for those areas and then drive the recommendation for that area of the field. So, okay, the map looks great, but how do I use it becomes the question. And it isn't just necessarily a map. It's a system of crop management. So if you have the growing season and time through along the bottom here, the first process is mapping the field to build the model. And then we'll apply the inputs and plant the crop. The first step is a plant stand check to see what the seed mortality is by zone. So we're trying to determine how much plants come up in each area of the field. This is what a plant stand would look like. So in this instance, soybeans were seeded at flat rate, and you can see that different areas of the field have different plant stand mortalities depending on the zone that they're in. Following this, there's a check done at pre-harvest to determine how is the crop behaving and interacting with the model, and we can make adjustments for the following year. And then post-harvest compare yield data if any check blocks have been put in. So we'll record all this information, synthesize it, and then adjust it for the following year and make incremental improvement. This is what makes SWAT Maps different than all other systems on the market. You have a model to go and ground truth and make adjustments for the following year, rather than just being given a digital soil test of here's your field, see you later kind of thing. So why use a soil water topography zone model instead of other systems on the market? Number one, it provides a static layer or a model for mobile nutrients and seed. Two, it's a systematic process. So every year you're sampling in the same spots and building a database on how those areas respond. It's repeatable. And there's an ecosystem to make incremental improvements year over year. We get the zones right first to reduce soil sampling costs, so then we can go and sample more frequently and take advantage of trying to manage temporal variability year over year. And lastly, there's a cost-benefit ratio that works in all cropping environments, and there's significant upside for the dollars invested because you're not rebuilding the model every single time you go to sample. So there are two service providers in Ontario. One is Deb Campbell with Agronomy Advantage, and then myself, Jonathan Zettler with Fieldwalker Agronomy. And that's what I have, Jen.
All right. I appreciate you taking the time, Jonathan. I just have a couple questions for you. So these SWAT maps, once they are utilized and produced, are they able to be put onto the piece of equipment which will be applying the fertilizer? Are they able to be moved to that GPS system?
So all the prescriptions that are generated are based off the SWAT Maps model. So you have your zone-based model, and then you work with an agronomist or retail, usually it's an agronomist, to come up with what rate to put in each zone. And then they provide the prescription to put in the piece of equipment to apply the nutrients.
And also, it looks like the way that the maps are created, if I saw that picture correctly, it looks like it's a piece of technology that is almost placed on an RTV. Is that correct?
Yes. So you can map the fields using an RTV pickup truck. In Western Canada, they're mounted on the back of air seeder sprayers. So there's a lot of different ways of collecting the data from that standpoint. Typically in Ontario, it's been on an RTV type unit.
All right. I really appreciate you taking the time today, Jonathan.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good day.